I recently read a fascinating article about a phenomenon that's called inattentional blindness, which suggested that unless we pay really close attention, we can sometimes miss the most obvious things happening around us. So picture this. You're driving down a familiar stretch of road, conscientiously watching the speedometer, the rearview mirror, and looking ahead for oncoming traffic, and moments too late, you notice a huge deer standing in the middle of the road. Try to move out of the way, but wham! You hit the deer. Now, after the incident, you try explaining to friends and family. You weren't distracted. I mean, you were paying attention. You had your eyes on the road, and of course, no one believes you. They think, oh, you must have been looking down at your phone or playing with the radio or doing something else. And they feel that way because intuitively, we believe that if our eyes are open, that we are seeing. Cognitive scientists also once believed the same thing, that visual perception is like a videotape. The mind records what the eyes take in. However, recent studies of visual perception have shown just how little people see when they're not paying attention. Thus, the phenomenon called inattentional blindness. While we think we would notice something as large and as obvious as a deer, simply put, if we're not actually looking for the deer, we may not see it. By definition, inattentional blindness, also called perceptual blindness, is a psychological lack of attention that's not associated with any vision defects or deficits. I once heard it said that we as humans are deletion creatures. Because we can't focus on everything all the time, our brains are constantly deleting information that it deems unimportant. As a result, a blindness effect can take place. That is, individuals fail to see certain objects or stimuli, and surprisingly, in many cases, it's often those things that are the most obvious and sometimes the most important that we can miss. Now, when I read this article, I have to admit, it made me feel a little better about myself, because I don't know about you, but this kind of thing happens to me all the time. I mean, do you ever have that experience like you're looking all around for something and it ends up being right there in front of your face the whole time? I mean, it's so frustrating. I mean, have you ever asked yourself, now where is that? Where's that salt shaker? You know, I just had it. It was right here, and then you're looking high and low. And then the more and more you look, the stranger and stranger the places you look are. Like, if you really think about it, it's probably never going to be in any of those places. And then you realize it ends up being right in front of your face, or worse yet, in your hands. Has that ever happened to you? Elizabeth will tell you, I'm notorious for this. I'm forever, Elizabeth, have you seen my guitar picks? Do you know where they are? And Josh, I just told you they're right on the table in front of you. Oh, okay, thanks, honey. It happens probably at least several times a week in our household. But a similar phenomenon of blindness can occur even when we see something so often, we actually don't see it anymore. It's like those commercials where we go nose blind to something. I've had so many visitors meet me here at church, and they'll comment on all sorts of things that they see coming in, and it's true. They're all there. But I just actually stop seeing them because I see them so much. I come in that way every day. Then there's those times when something is so unpleasant, something that we really don't want to see, that we choose consciously or maybe even unconsciously not to see it anymore. Does anybody remember the old Alfred Hitchcock Presents episodes? They were kind of like mystery shows. They were black and white. I never forget one that I saw. It was an episode called None Are So Blind. And the plot consisted of an egotistical actor named Seymour that committed a crime, and he put the blame on this fake persona that he had created using makeup and a wig. And it's this fake persona he called Antonio. So for years, I mean, it was an interesting and well thought out plan. For years, he actually lived as a double life. He was himself and he was Antonio, all building up so he could commit this crime and then blame it on this fake persona, so that then when they would look for that person who committed the crime, they wouldn't be able to find him. But Seymour's plan fails because of his own willful blindness to his own faults, that he no longer sees that he has a distinctive facial mole on his face, which would give the disguise away from any distance. So the entire episode, it was neat because it was filmed in such a way that you only ever saw the left side of the actor's face until the very end when you saw that he had this mole. But the mole was so unpleasant for the actor that he actually chose not to see it, and he didn't see it anymore, and he got caught for the crime. The point is that sometimes we can miss the most obvious things, things that are big, things that are really important, just because we're not paying attention. And in all of these cases, the deer in the road, the missing salt shaker, or the mole on the actor's face, no one saw the writing on the wall. As I mentioned, the text of terror for this week is a terrifying one. It actually plays out like something you'd see in an old mystery or Alfred Hitchcock episode. It's not a scripture we hear preached from very often, but it's where we get the very popular phrase, the writing on the wall. And this phrase I've heard more times than I can even count over the last several months. From everything relating to big sporting events to a certain election we had, everyone was talking about seeing, or in some cases not seeing, the writing on the wall. In Daniel 5, our setting is a great festival held by King Belshazzar, who the scripture says is the son of King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, as just a reminder of biblical history, Nebuchadnezzar is the Babylonian king who conquered the southern Israelite kingdom of Judah and destroyed the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Our story takes place during the time of exile for the Israelites and happens at a turning point for that Babylonian empire. So we pick up at the festival. King Belshazzar made a great festival for 1,000 of his lords, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. Under the influence of the wine, Belshazzar commanded that they bring in the vessels of gold and silver that his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the vessels of gold and silver that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Immediately, the fingers of a human hand appeared and began writing on the plaster of the wall of the royal palace, next to the lampstand. The king was watching the hand as it wrote. Then the king's face turned pale, and his thoughts terrified him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king cried aloud to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. And the king said to the wise men of Babylon, "Whoever can read this writing and tell me its interpretation shall be clothed in purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and rank third in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar became greatly terrified. His face turned pale, and his lords were perplexed. Now, just to review, the king was kicking back, drinking some wine, enjoying this huge party of excess. And out of nowhere, a human hand, just a hand, appears and starts writing on the wall of the palace. Now, not only is the whole hand thing kind of terrifying, but also neither the king nor anyone in the palace could actually understand the writing that happened on the wall. Behind me is a Rembrandt depiction of the scene. So after overhearing the king and his lords talking about what happened, the queen tells the king that there's a man in the kingdom, a man who is endowed with the spirit of the holy gods, found to have enlightenment, understanding, and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods. The queen, of course, was speaking of Daniel. So the king calls for Daniel, and when Daniel arrives, the king offers him all the power within his kingdom if he can interpret the writing. Now, at first, Daniel refuses the king's offer, but he does agree to interpret the writing. Daniel begins by reminding Belshazzar that Nebuchadnezzar was shown the power of God, saying, "He was driven from human society, and his mind was made like that of an animal. His dwelling was with the wild asses. He was fed grass like oxen, and his body was bathed with the dew of heaven, until he learned that the Most High God has sovereignty over the kingdom of mortals, and sets over it whomsoever he will." Daniel goes on to say, "And you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. You have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. The vessels of his temple have been brought in before you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have been drinking wine from them. You have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose power your very breath, and to whom belong all your ways, you have not honored. And then finally, the interpretation. So from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed: Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed in purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made concerning him that he should rank third in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. That's the end of the story. Now, as Pastor Pam said last week, we as preachers, we feel called to share the good news in Scripture. And in some cases, that good news isn't always easy to see at first glance. But the truth is, many of our Bible stories reflect life in that they can sometimes be pretty messy. And this story is no exception. Belshazzar, easily identified as the antagonist of the story, so blinded by a life of excess and power that he doesn't even recognize God. Many interpreters see this as the main takeaway from the Scripture. Hebrew scholar Daniel L. Smith Christopher notes that the main theme of the story is the intoxication of power, and draws comparisons of Belshazzar's feast to the conquering of native holy sites by Captain Cook and the desecration of the indigenous people of America during colonialization. Author and researcher Gary Martin, who runs a website called Phrase Finder, writes that the point of the moral tale was that Belshazzar couldn't see the warning that was apparent to others because he was engrossed in his sinning ways. I tend to agree with both of these authors. And this warning of excess and abuse really does echo Pastor Pam's scripture from James last week. But I also note that Belshazzar, this villain who desecrated the temple riches, kept Israelites in slavery, and worshiped false gods, pretty much everything you can do in the Hebrew Bible that's wrong. Belshazzar is someone who God is still trying to reach, even at the end of his existence. God didn't have to go through the trouble of trying to communicate with Belshazzar and could have just let him meet his fate, but God didn't. So, in that sense, no matter how blinded we may be, or no matter how lost we are, God is still reaching for us. God is still trying to reach even the most unreachable of souls. Not to the same degree, but like Belshazzar, we can all be blinded sometimes to where God's calling us. Blinded by fear, blinded by overwhelm, or just simply blinded because we stopped listening for where God is calling us. So I ask, where are our blind spots? Where is God calling us? Where is the writing on the wall that we should be paying attention to? Where should we be focusing, both as individuals and as a community? It's impossible to focus on everything all the time. We just don't have the capacity. Only God has that capacity. And as individuals and community, it's easy to put so much focus on one area that we can become blind to a growing deficit that exists in another. This happens to churches all the time. One can be so focused on helping their own community that they lose focus on helping the world outside of that community. Sometimes it's the other way around. The focus can be so much on global issues that a community focus can get lost, and so on. Since we can't focus on everything all the time, we need to be attuned to God's writing on the wall. But how do we do that? I mean, in our scripture, even after Belshazzar sees the writing on the wall, he doesn't understand it. Yet Daniel, who we read throughout the book, spends much of his time in prayer, is able to see and interpret the writing on the wall. Like anything, the more time and energy we put into something, the better we get at it. We often talk about spending time in prayer as a spiritual practice, the notion that we practice something so we can develop and grow. And we see this evident here. If prayer is conversation with God, Daniel is constantly in conversation with God and therefore can understand God's voice and interpret the writing on the wall. We know that whatever we focus on, we tend to move towards. We've used the analogy before of a race car driver, that if you're racing and you go into a spin, that you shouldn't focus on the wall, you should focus on where you want to go, because if you focus on the wall, you'll actually start turning your wheel towards wherever you're focusing. So if we don't focus on something, we tend to move away from it. Makes sense? So it's important that we stay connected to God and to those we trust and care about to help us see the writing on the wall for those areas that we might be blindly moving away from. Have you ever found yourself saying of someone, how could they not see that one coming? How could they be so blind to that? Or how could they not see that about themselves? How do they not know they're coming across to people that way? How is that even possible? Or worse yet, maybe that's someone's you. Maybe you said to yourself, how did I not see that one coming? The Bible certainly gives us plenty of examples of didn't see that one coming. There was David and Goliath, who didn't think a small-statured boy like David had a chance against him. There was King Eglon, who was killed by Ehud because his guards didn't expect a left-handed assassin. There were those residents of Sodom and Gomorrah, pretty much everybody who saw Noah building the ark other than his family, and even Peter, who absolutely could not believe Jesus when Jesus said he would deny him 3 times. In all of these biblical examples, it was inconceivable to those characters, including King Belshazzar, that things could play out other than the way they thought. They were so sure of a result that when things played out different than expectations, they still couldn't believe it. Even after the hand of God writes on the palace wall, and Daniel interprets that writing, Belshazzar still doesn't change his ways, only to end up dead later that evening with the kingdom divided. We need to stay connected with God through prayer so we can hear where God is calling us. We need to pay attention to the writing on the wall for those places where we may be blind. And in addition, we need to do something when we feel that call to put more focus towards something. As a church community, I see many examples of us doing this well. In recent years, when our income exceeded our expenses, we discerned. We listened to where God's voice was calling us and looked for the writing on the wall as to where those resources were in need. We've noted that in this time of growth, with worship attendance numbers up and partner relations with 2 other congregations, that we also need to grow in how we care for those in our midst who are not able to attend our worship service. And we're looking for more effective ways to provide accessibility to those worship services. As humans, we give more of our time, our resources, and ourselves to those areas we focus on the most. And all too often, we can get so busy living life that we never really take the time for self-examination and to think about those areas that we don't think about. Like Belshazzar, we can get lost in our distractions, whatever those distractions may be. In Paul, we read that nothing can separate us from the love of God, and we can best experience God's love and see the writing on the wall where God is calling us when we are clear-headed and we are listening for God's voice. Before we take the offering this morning, before the ushers come forward, I'm going to invite us into a brief time of silent reflection. And during this time, I invite you, right here, right now, to open yourself to God and to note one, and just one, area of your life that you feel has not been giving the focus it deserves. Maybe you want to write it down. Maybe if you have a cell phone, maybe you want to send yourself a text message. Where do you see God's writing on the wall that this is an area for you that needs some attention? Perhaps you're so busy and focused on achieving something that there's a relationship that you've become temporarily blind to. Or maybe you've been so focused on a specific individual or relationship that you've let another important relationship or area of your life go. Maybe you've been so focused outwardly that you haven't taken time to focus on yourself, your prayer life, your own spiritual growth, or the spiritual growth of those you love. Perhaps you've been so inwardly focused that you've gone blind to the needs of those around you. I encourage you to discern one area that God is calling you to give additional focus. Where do you see the writing on the wall? It's not often that I get the opportunity to preach a sermon and have an actual popular song match the theme of the sermon. So a popular song written actually in 2015, popular in 2016, is actually called The Writings on the Wall. Now, sometimes popular music doesn't always translate well to sermon themes and sermon music. But this one I found really interesting in the sense that if we think about this from the perspective of Belshazzar, and on that last night of his life, I hear these lyrics, and I'll read these lyrics just because, as we know, sometimes lyrics of popular music can be difficult to understand as is, and this happens to be a Sam Smith song that is really Sam Smith high falsetto, which makes it even that much more indecipherable. But the lyrics are, I feel a storm is coming, and if I'm going to make it through the day, there's no more use in running. This is something I have to face. If I risk it all, could you, God, break my fall? How do I live? How do I breathe when you're not here? I'm suffocating. I want to feel love run through my blood. Tell me, is this where I give it all up? For you, I have to risk it all because the writing's on the wall. I've been here before, always hit the floor. I've spent a lifetime running, always get away. With you I'm feeling something that makes me want to stay. I'm prepared for this. Never shoot to miss, but I feel like a storm is coming. I'm gonna make it through the day, and there's no more use in running. It's something I gotta face. If I risk it all, could you break my fall? How do I live? How do I breathe? When you're not here, I'm suffocating. I wanna feel love run through my blood. Tell me, is this where I give it all up? With you, I have to risk it all, 'cause the writing's on the wall. How do I live? How do I breathe? When you're not here, I'm suffocating. I wanna feel love run through my blood. Tell me, is this where I give it all up? With you, I have to